They said she was mad. First, it was the way she'd gone quiet after her brother didn't come back from the mountains. Then, how she stopped praying at the chapel and started speaking to the crows that lingered on her rooftop come dawn. When her father took sick and died with her name half-formed on his lips, she didn't cry or call for the doctor. She took the hound and a shovel and dug the grave herself, dusk to dawn, without a word to any neighbor who wandered up the ridge to offer help. After that, she was gone from town more than she was in it. Some claimed she slept among the elk in the winter fields. Others swore they saw her stroking the neck of a wild mustang, murmuring in a tongue no Christian woman should know. Children peeked through the trees, eyes wide as she coaxed a lynx down from a snow-heavy pine with a whisper and a scrap of salt pork. They said she spoke to animals, not men, and perhaps that was half the reason the valley kept its distance. Her name was Mara. Folks used it sparingly. The highland winters were brutal in their stillness, but spring brought sound. First, in the low thunder of meltwater cutting down the gorges, and then in the hoofbeats of travelers crossing northward into the less settled ranges. That spring, a stranger came with them. His name was Elijah Kane. He rode a flea-bitten dun and wore his past like a coat turned inside out, hard to look at directly, though folks tried. He was taller than most, with a rifle like a promise strapped across his back, and a quiet way about him that made folks guess he wasn't running from the law, but not running toward anything either. Elijah didn't ask many questions when he bought a plot near the tree line, just said he'd be building a cabin come fall and needed a place to work the land. The locals nodded, skeptical, but took his coin anyway. Newcomers were common enough. It was their staying that proved rare. The first time he saw Mara, she was crouched in a clearing, her fingers sunk into the soil as if feeling for the pulse of the earth. A red fox lounged nearby, alert but unafraid, and birds trilled from the low firs as if she'd taught them every note. Elijah stood at the tree line, uncertain. He wasn't a superstitious man, not after what he'd seen in the war and the years that followed, but something in the quiet way she held the forest made his breath catch in his chest. She looked up, not startled but aware. Her eyes were the color of a riverbank after rain, brown with flecks of gold. She didn't speak, not to him. He raised a hand, polite. "Evenin'," he said. Mara tilted her head. The fox sat up, staring. Elijah waited. When she offered no reply, only a slight narrowing of her eyes, he nodded and stepped back into the trees. Back in town, the blacksmith's wife told him, "Don't go pawkin' around her land. She don't take kindly to menfolk meddling." Another woman added, "She's not simple, she's just different, been through more than most." Elijah didn't ask what they meant. He'd been through his own wars, his own graves dug. Pain was a language he knew in the dark. Over the weeks that followed, their paths crossed more often than not. He'd see her down by the creek, whispering to a pair of badgers nosing in the reeds. Once he watched as she untangled a hawk's foot from a snare with a gentleness that made his throat ache. She never spoke to him, not in words, but she didn't chase him off either. Sometimes she met his eyes. That was something. He began to bring offerings, a broken horseshoe she might use for mending, a satchel of dried apples. Once he left a scarf of soft wool, the kind that could guard a thin neck against mountain frost. He never left them close, just near enough for her to find if she chose. She never returned them nor acknowledged them, but once he found the scarf tied to the limb of a pine outside his cabin, fluttering like a flag. He took it down and wore it. Then came the morning when he found the deer. It was a young buck, ribs like fence slats, lying near his woodpile. Its breath came ragged, and a shattered arrow jutted from its flank. Elijah dropped to one knee. He'd seen men die like that, slow and shaking. He reached to touch the wound, but the deer flinched. There was a whistle behind him, not human. He turned. Mara stood a few yards off, her hand outstretched in the air, fingers curling in a silent gesture he didn't understand. The deer stilled. She stepped forward. Elijah moved back, instinctively giving her space. She knelt beside the animal and placed her palm to its chest. A stream of words flowed from her, low, melodic, strange. The deer blinked once, then again. She worked quickly, binding the wound with herbs pulled from her satchel. When she finished, she leaned in, nose near the deer's ear, and said something that made it rise, slow and trembling, and limp into the trees. Elijah stared. She stood and brushed her hands on her skirt. "Thank you," he said. Mara looked at him a long while. Then, just as she turned to leave, she said one word, low and sure. "You're welcome." It was the first time she'd spoken to a man in 5 years. Come summer, the valley turned green with abandon. Lupin and fireweed painted the meadows like spilled ink, and the creeks ran clear and high, cold enough to numb bone. Elijah worked his land with steady hands and quiet patience, building his cabin log by log, the rhythm of the axe a kind of hymn. He slept in Alinta for weeks, the stars his roof and the earth his bed, and each night the howl of wolves or the rustle of elk in the underbrush reminded him how far he'd come from war and city dust. He didn't see Mara often, but when he did, he no longer looked away, and she no longer disappeared into the trees like smoke. One dusk he found her seated beside a fallen tree, sharpening a flint blade. A magpie hopped along the log beside her, chattering. When it saw Elijah, it squawked and flapped once, but did not flee. Mara lifted her eyes and held his gaze. He crouched a few paces off and rested his arms on his knees. "I don't mean to trouble you." "You're not," she said, and that was it. But it was more than enough. She spoke rarely and only when it mattered. That suited Elijah. He'd come from a place where talk was cheap and promises cheaper. Here, every word was weighted, carried like a stone in the palm before being offered. He liked that about her. Sometimes they worked near each other without speaking, Mara gathering yarrow and birch bark, Elijah splitting logs for winter. Once she handed him a coil of spruce root to bind his roof slats. Another time, he lent her his knife when hers snapped at the hilt. Little things, unspoken trust. The first true conversation came after a storm. A hard wind had screamed down from the pass, tearing shingles from the town's saloon and flooding the lower fields. Elijah's saplings bent sideways, but held. The next morning, he found one of his ewes tangled in a branch, half drowned. He cut her free, carried her to shelter, but she didn't stand. He sat beside her, frustrated, helpless. Mara arrived as if drawn by scent or sound. She knelt without speaking, her fingers brushing the ew's ears, her lips moving in words too soft for him to hear. Then she looked up at him. "She's frightened," she said, "not broken." Elijah watched her coax the ewe to its feet with murmurs and slow strokes. When it finally rose and staggered to a pile of hay, he exhaled like he hadn't breathed in hours. "You're good with them," he said. Mara's gaze was level. "They listen." "You ever try with people?" She didn't flinch, but something shuddered in her face. "No." He regretted the question. She rose to leave, but he said, "Wait." He reached in his pocket and pulled out a carved whistle, the kind used for signaling dogs, made from willow and hollowed bone. "Found this years ago, thought it might be useful. If you ever need something, help, you can use it." Mara took it, her thumb traced its edge. She didn't smile, but she nodded once, deep and certain. From that day on, their bond deepened, not in declarations or confessions, but in presence. He'd find small markers on the edge of his land, bundles of sage, a fish cleaned and wrapped in broadleaf antler tips carved into symbols he didn't recognize but came to respect. In return, he left tools sharpened, salt blocks for the animals she watched over, and once, a sketch of her fox companion etched in charcoal on birch bark. She never mentioned it, but a week later, he found a hawk feather tied above his door. Then came the night of the fire. Lightning struck the northern ridge, and wind turned it into a beast that roared through the dry woods. Townsfolk panicked, herded livestock, prayed as ash fell like snow. Elijah grabbed his rifle, not for looters, but to help guide the frightened horses, and ran toward the tree line. Mara was already there. She moved like wind through branches, barefoot, eyes sharp. She spoke in that strange, half-sung cadence, and animals fled toward the river instead of the flames. Elk, deer, even a bear cub following its limping mother. He watched her stand before a panicked Mustang and whisper it still. The air cracked with fire, but she didn't flinch. Elijah ran to her. "The wind's changing, you'll get caught." She didn't answer, just pointed to a trapped fox kit under a burned log. He understood. Together they lifted it free, wrapped it in his coat. As the smoke thickened, Mara faltered, coughing. Elijah caught her wrist. "This way." She hesitated, years of solitude flaring in her eyes. Then she nodded. They ran, side by side, down toward the creek, the fox held tight between them. Fire chased them with a hiss and crackle, but they made the bank just as the rain came. Cold, hard, blessed. Under a slick tarp beside the water, they waited out the night. The fox whimpered. Mara stroked its ears and said, You were brave." She wasn't speaking to the fox, not entirely. Elijah, soaked to the skin, leaned against a stone and asked, "Why them? Why not people?" She stared into the dark. "Animals don't lie, they don't hurt for sport. They listen when they love, and they leave when they don't." He didn't press. Instead, he said, "I listen." Silence stretched between them, not empty, but full. Myra nodded once. "You do." And with that, a new word joined their strange language. Trust. Autumn crept in slow, the kind that arrived not with frost but with hush. Leaves turned the color of old copper, and the sun softened into a low, honey-colored presence that hovered just above the treetops. Elk bugled in the distance, calling through the dusk like ghosts of old warriors, and every living thing seemed to be drawing breath before the long sleep of winter. Elijah's cabin was nearly finished, and Mara began coming by more often, not by plan or promise, but in the way of wild things who choose their own paths. Sometimes she brought herbs she'd foraged, sometimes a skin of something fermented and sharp that made him laugh the first time it hit his throat. Other times, she brought nothing but herself, which he came to understand was the rarest offering of all. One morning he found her standing by the paddock, watching his mare give birth. She did not speak, but stayed until the foal stood, legs trembling, eyes wide with the shock of life, and only then did she turn to him and say, "You built her a good place." It wasn't praise, it was recognition. The land between them became a thread, never pulled taut but never slack either. He learned the rhythms of her silences, the way she nodded when she meant yes, how her brow knit when something felt wrong. He started to read the trees the way she did, noticed when the birds flew low or the deer crossed the ridge early in the day. The forest had always been alive, but now it spoke in ways he was only beginning to understand. She never came inside his cabin, not once, but she helped him thatch the roof before the first snow, her hands quick and practiced. She laughed once when he slipped on the ladder, and the sound startled a raven from a nearby limb. He would remember that sound more clearly than the war, more clearly than any song. One cold morning, Myra arrived with a look he hadn't seen before, something tight in her jaw, something shadowed behind her eyes. "There's trouble," she said. He followed without asking. They hiked 2 hours north to a clearing by the old riverbed. A black bear cub lay moaning, a rusted trap clamped to its leg. Mara knelt by it, whispering, while Elijah worked the iron open. The mother bear watched from the tree line, immense and silent. Mara glanced once at her, then at Elijah. "She trusts me," she said, "but only because you're here." He didn't understand what she meant until later, when the cub limped off and the mother turned her great head toward them and let out a low, throaty rumble, not warning, not threat, something like a blessing. They sat on a fallen log afterward, watching clouds form in the valley below. "She was caught once," Mara said, eyes distant. "Years ago, a hunter passing through said he mistook her for a wolf. He laughed when he told the sheriff." Her voice had no tremor, but her hands were fisted in her skirt. "I didn't speak for months, not to anyone." Elijah didn't reach for her, he didn't speak either. She exhaled. "After that, I listened, to things that couldn't hurt me the way men could." He said nothing, only let her words settle like snow. Later, as they descended back toward the valley, she stopped at the edge of the wood. "There are still those who'd hurt what's wild," she said, "but not you." He met her eyes. "No, not me." That night, as he lay in his bed, the wind creaked against the walls, and he thought of how many languages there were in the world. Not the ones with grammar and dictionaries, but the ones built from silence and wounds, from offerings left in snow and glances that held more than touch. He was learning hers. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the valley thick and fast. The river froze shallow, and elk moved closer to the cabin for forage. Elijah chopped wood until his hands cracked, and Mara brought him a salve that smelled of cedar and pine resin. She never explained what was in it, but it worked. They spent long evenings by the fire outside, never inside, sharing warmth, sharing stories without names. He told her once of his brother, who died in a canyon ambush, and how he hadn't spoken for 3 days after burying him. She nodded, but said nothing. Later that week, he found a small bundle on his doorstep, a hawthorn branch, a black stone, and a single crow feather bound in twine. He didn't know what they meant, not exactly, but it felt like she had answered. Then, near solstice, a stranger arrived in town. Rafe Thurman was tall, sharp-faced, and walked like a man used to watching his own back. Said he was trapping lynx for their pelts. Said he'd heard of a woman who could talk to beasts. When Elijah heard the name on wind-whipped lips at the general store, something cold bloomed in his chest. He warned Mara that night, as they stood in the hush of the trees. She didn't flinch. He's come before, he'll come again. Elijah stepped closer, voice low. Not while I'm breathing. Mara tilted her head. That's not your vow to make. He looked at her, heart pounding. It is, I just did. She watched him a long moment. Then she reached for his hand, not to hold it, but to place something inside it. A pendant, carved from antler, worn smooth with age. A bird, wings spread, its beak open in song. For strength, she said. And as he closed his fingers around it, Elijah realized she'd given him something sacred. Not a promise, but a name. The snows deepened, turning the valley into a world of silence and white. Smoke rose slow from chimneys, and every step crunched like breaking bones beneath the crust of ice. Mara moved through it as if born of frost, hood drawn, boots wrapped in hides, her breath a ghost trailing behind. Elijah watched for her more often now, scanning the tree line each morning, each dusk, until he caught the faintest motion, the shimmer of her presence like a spirit come to call. Rafe Thurman stayed. He rented a room at the back of the saloon, rarely spoke unless pressed, and spent most days trailing the edge of the forest with his traps and iron teeth. No one liked him much, but folks had learned not to question the kind of man who carried knives like jewelry and smiled with nothing in his eyes. One evening, Elijah found a blood trail not far from his cabin. It led to a fox, whimpering under a spruce, one leg mangled beyond healing. He ended its pain clean, then buried it beside the river. No snare in sight, but he knew whose work it was. He told Mara that night. They stood beneath the bare branches, the sky rimmed in stars. She said nothing, just reached down and touched the dirt where the fox lay. Her lips moved, soft as prayer, but her eyes were hard as iron. He hunts for profit, she said, not for need. Elijah felt something old stirring in him, the same thing he'd felt when marching toward gunfire years ago, something not quite anger, not quite fear. Resolve. He needs to be stopped. Mara turned her gaze to him. You'd fight for this. He nodded. For you. She looked away. Then you don't understand. He waited. I don't need saving, she said. I need remembering. I need someone who sees me without reaching to possess. I see you, he said. The snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried. That night Elijah sat by his fire, the antler pendant warm against his chest. He did not sleep. The next morning he found one of Mara's signals, a twisted cord of bark tied in a cross and hung on a pine near his trail. Warning. He followed the path she'd marked, through groves where wind whistled mournful tunes, past prints of elk and hare and heavier boots not meant to be there. At last, in a clearing dusted with frost, he found Rafe. The trapper was crouched beside a downed lynx, its leg bloodied but alive. Rafe reached for another snare. Elijah stepped out with his rifle slung loose, but ready. That's enough, he said. Rafe looked up, grinning. Well now, Cain, isn't it? Didn't figure you for a sentimentalist. Elijah didn't smile. I won't warn you twice. Rafe stood slow and easy, hand resting on his belt where a blade hung. This ain't your land. It's hers. Rafe's eyes flicked past Elijah into the trees. Ah, the witch, I've heard stories. She's not yours to speak of. The lynx yowled, trying to pull away. Rafe took a step forward. You gonna fight me for a cat and a woman who don't even speak your tongue? I'm already fightin', Elijah said, and raised his rifle. They didn't speak after that. It wasn't a long fight. Elijah's shot went wide on purpose, but it was enough to send Rafe staggering back, his boot slipping in snow. He didn't fall, but he understood. When Elijah lowered the barrel, Rafe spat and muttered something sharp under his breath. He left that day, no goodbyes. Mara found Elijah at the edge of the clearing. He hadn't seen her come. She knelt beside the lynx and whispered to it, soothing. It limped away, vanishing into the trees. Elijah said nothing. Mara rose, her expression unreadable. Then she reached out and pressed her hand to his chest, over the pendant. You speak now, she said, not with words but with what matters. He didn't know what to say to that. So he touched her hand in return, gently. Her eyes closed. That winter became a story of long nights and quiet company. They did not speak of what passed. Mara began to enter his cabin, not to stay, but to sit by the hearth when the cold grew cruel. She mended his gloves with sinew thread. He read aloud from an old book, not expecting her to answer, just to listen. She did. One evening he found her asleep beside the fire, her fox curled against her hip. He didn't wake her. He laid a blanket across them and sat by the window, watching snow fall like ash from a quieter world. He thought of language, of how people built bridges with it, or walls, and how sometimes it was the space between words that held the most truth. Outside, a lone owl called across the night. Inside, her breathing matched the rhythm of his own. Spring came late that year. The snow retreated in stubborn layers, reluctant to surrender its grip on the high places. Trees budded slow, shy as deer, and the river swelled with meltwater that whispered secrets to anyone willing to listen. Elijah tended his land with a quiet diligence, but his eyes wandered often to the edge of the trees where Mara sometimes stood, half shadow, half light, watching the thaw like it might betray her. She hadn't slept in his cabin again, not since that one night beside the fire, but she came often, bringing roots and dried berries, sometimes feathers twisted into charms he didn't understand but hung anyway. They didn't name what they were becoming. There were no words for it yet. One morning, Mara appeared with a gash on her arm, wrapped in a strip of hide already soaked through. He brought her inside without a word, set her down on the bench beside the stove. She didn't flinch when he unwrapped it, though the wound ran deep. Her fox curled at her feet, ears back, watchful. "Cougar," she said, "caught between cub and river." He cleaned the wound gently, hands steadier than he expected. "Why risk it?" Mara shrugged, "Because it didn't know any better, because I did." She winced as he poured spirits over the cut, but didn't look away. "You could have been killed." "So could you," she said, "when you stood in that clearing." He met her gaze. There was no accusation there, only a shared weight, like two people who had carried something heavy a long way and finally found a place to rest. He stitched the wound in silence. When he was done, she reached out and traced his jaw with her fingers. Not a caress, not quite, more like a question. "You never ask for more than I give," she said. "I never want more than you offer." Her hand fell away, she nodded. That spring brought change. A drought settled low over the valley, early and mean. Ponds dried to cracked clay, and even the creek near Mara's ridge thinned to a trickle. The animals grew restless, searching farther and staying out longer. Mara wandered deeper into the high country, sometimes gone for days. Elijah watched the ridge for her return, kept the fire ready, the water cool. She came back thinner, sun-browned, her hair tangled with leaves. "There's something wrong in the north," she said one evening, sitting on the ground beside his porch. "The elk are moving too early, birds are flying west, they know something." Elijah sharpened his knife slowly, watching the light shift in her eyes. "Fire?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not yet, something else." That night the fox wouldn't settle. It paced near the door, whining, then vanished into the trees. Mara stood by the open window, listening. "They feel it before we do," she said. In the days that followed, the animals began to flee, not in a rush, but in a quiet, steady exodus. Mara followed them sometimes, tracking their paths, reading the signs. She spoke little, ate less. Elijah worried in the way men do when they can't fix a thing with their hands. Then came the thunder, deep and distant. Not from the sky, but from the ground. Elijah was at the barn when it came, a rumble beneath his boots that made the planks tremble. The earth heaved once, then settled, but not before a tree near the river cracked and fell. Birds shrieked from the canopy. The horses spooked. Mara appeared that evening, wild-eyed. "There's movement underground," she said. "Shifting, the animals knew." They stood side by side, watching dust rise from a fissure near the ravine. Mara knelt beside it, touched the stone. "This valley is changing, waking." Elijah looked out over the hills. "What do we do?" "We listen," she said. In the weeks that followed, the earth shifted again, small, creeping changes. Springs dried. New ones burst forth in unlikely places. Whole flocks vanished. Some nights the forest went utterly silent. Mara began marking the changes with charcoal on birch bark. She taught Elijah how to read the signs, tracks that led nowhere, birds circling dead trees, new growth sprouting where none should. He listened. He learned. One evening they sat by the river, their feet in the water, watching the last of the ice float downstream. Mara leaned against him, not seeking warmth, but anchoring. "I never thought I'd stay," she said, voice barely more than wind. "You don't have to," he said. She was quiet a long time. "But I want to." He reached down and held her hand, not tightly, just enough. "I've learned your language," he said, "but I don't know the ending." She smiled, soft and crooked. "Neither do I, that's why it's worth speaking." Above them the stars began to appear, one by one, silent and sure. And somewhere in the dark, the earth turned, whispering its own story beneath their feet. Summer came with thunderclouds and breathless heat. The air hung heavy, thick with pollen and the hush before a storm. Trees bent under the weight of it, and even the birds fell quiet some days, watching the sky with restless wings. Mara walked the woods barefoot, her dress sweat darkened, hair braided in a crown that kept it off her neck. She'd begun singing again, not for people, not even for Elijah, but to the forest. Low songs with no words, just breath and note, like lullabies for the roots beneath her feet. Elijah built a bench beneath the shade of an ash tree and waited for her there each evening. She always came. Sometimes she sat, sometimes she paced, but always she stayed. The land shifted again, not with violence this time, but with something slower, older. Springs bubbled where none had been. The earth beneath the cabin's north wall cracked open with moss and warmth. The animals returned, cautious. Mara said it was the valley healing itself. "You can feel it?" he asked her one night. She nodded, "Same way I felt you." He looked at her then, like a man seeing light through fog. "You're not running anymore," he said. "No," she answered. "I was always meant to return." One afternoon, they found a fawn near the river, orphaned and shivering. Mara knelt beside it, placed a hand on its trembling side. "She won't live unless we take her in." Elijah built a pen beside the barn, fashioned a shade from willow branches, fed the fawn with milk soaked in linen. Mara sat with it each night, humming, her fingers brushing its flank like she might knit its fear into something softer. He watched her from the porch, heart fuller than he'd known it could be. When the fawn began to walk without fear, Mara smiled. She remembers now that the world can be kind. The drought broke in late July. Rain fell like a blessing, soaking the parched soil, painting the leaves deep and bright. Streams sang louder. The river rose. Mara stood in the open, arms wide, face turned skyward as water drenched her through. Elijah joined her. They laughed, first hers, then his, and danced in the mud like children. That night, soaked and breathless, she stepped into his cabin and did not leave when the fire burned low. She lay beside him, her breath warm against his collarbone, her hand on his chest like a promise. "In the dark," she said, "I used to think silence was safety." "It was," he said, "but not anymore." He turned toward her. "Why not?" "Because now there's something worth speaking for." The days grew long and golden. They planted a garden behind the cabin, onions, beans, sunflowers that turned their faces to the sky like worshippers. The fawn grew into a lithe doe and wandered farther, but always returned. Mara taught Elijah the names of herbs, the meanings of tracks, how to tell when a raven carried a warning. He taught her how to mend a fence with iron nails, how to throw a lasso just right to catch a straying goat. They built a life without planning it, each day woven into the next with soft thread and the steadiness of shared breath. Word spread, as it always did. Travelers came to the valley not just for trade or water, but to ask for her. The woman who spoke to beasts. Some brought sick animals, some sought guidance. She never turned them away, but neither did she let them too close. Only Elijah remained at her side, the one she didn't send back to the trail. One night, as fire crackled and coyotes howled far off, she reached for his hand. "Do you ever wish I were different?" she asked. "Easier to understand." He shook his head. "I never wanted easy, I wanted true." She closed her eyes. "I think I found a home." He didn't speak, only pulled her close. Let the silence say what words never could. Years later, when strangers asked how they came to be, her and the quiet man with hands like earth and eyes like dusk, she would tell them nothing, not with her mouth. She would point to the fox sleeping by the hearth, the garden blooming wild with bees, the doe grazing at the edge of the trees. And if they stayed long enough, they'd see him come up the path, dirt on his boots, a smile that belonged to no one else but her. She spoke to animals, not men. But he had learned her language. And she had spoken back.